Thank you very much. Well, as Patrick said, this talk will not be technical. I am with Nixu. That's a company that has a lot of technical people. Some of them are Matthijs van Ommeren, Erwin Paternotte. They're highly skilled. They do every sort of testing. They test software, they test hardware. And when I joined Nixu and I started talking with them and talking about the reporting, and then they said, well, you have a very different view on how these reports than we do. That's interesting. And maybe you should share that information. So that was the reason why I came to the idea of this talk. Myself, I've been a CISO for quite a long time. I've worked for the Port of Rotterdam as a CISO. I've worked for KPN. I've worked for Fokker Aircraft Company, for Fokker Aerostructures. And I had lots of contacts with all kinds of, let's say, security researchers, pen testers, all kinds of technical people. So will it blend? I think in the end everything blends. What you see in the picture here is an art project from the year 2000, where an artist put 10 fully functional blenders in a museum. And he put water and goldfish in it. And well, the visitors to the exposition were able to switch on, and some of them did. So what does a CISO do? Well, this is kind of the boring part. This is what the theory says. You do risk management, you do compliance and audits and security and stuff. There are all kinds of nice images to be found on the internet. But in the end, you do just this. It's your goal as a CISO to protect the organization from all kinds of problems regarding information. Now, this is how it's organized. Not always, but let's say in 80% or so, this is the way the CISO is placed in the organization. He's reporting to the CIO, and the CIO is reporting to some CFO or CEO or someone at board level. So what does the CIO do? The CISO keeps the CIO happy. That's what he does. And the CIO keeps the board happy. That's what you have to keep in mind. So the CIO has to deal with all kinds of things. He has to deal with, let's say, the standard IT things. The organization is demanding computers that always work, applications that always work. They want projects to be started and performed and brought to a good end. And is let's say, standard set of headache things, legacy, consumerization, that kind of things. And there are also here in the right risks. And yeah, risks are a bit different than the other two things. Oops. So the question is, for the CIO, where do you put your money in? You can put your money only in one thing at a time. So anyone who will put his money first in risks? No one? That's because of this. On the left side, you find what I always call the real things. They are there. The risk, however, they are not real. They are only real when they happen, and most of the time they don't happen. So they're unreal things, and a CIO will always choose first time when he needs to make a choice first for real things. That's what is demanded of him. That does, however, not mean that they don't act on risks, but they will act on materialized risks. So, for instance, when we had the DigiNotar hack, And DigiNotar, that was a Dutch certificate authority. And they came in the news because in 2011, there was a security breach, and they started issuing fraudulent certificates. Then the CIO and the CFO and the CEO, all the board level acted. It was the only time in my whole career that I was directly called by phone by the CFO at that time on my day off. And it's not only in information security that you see these things, because if you look at big things, for instance, the watersnoodramp, the big flood in 1955. It was only then when the Delta Werken projects, the Delta Works was performed, and they constructed a series of dams and locks and dikes to protect the land. But therefore, there was only talks about it. No one would invest it. And you see also, let's say civilian people do it. My father-in-law owned a company and installed burglar alarms, but he only installed them with people who were already burglared. So always after the risk was real, when it materialized. So the risk analysis is always considered kind of fake news. On this slide, there are things that can go wrong, that can only go wrong, and things that only can go right. And one of my CIOs I worked for, they called them satisfiers and dissatisfiers. And I think you recognize it. A thing like operations can only go wrong, because no one's going to call you and saying that, oh, I'm so grateful, I'm so happy that the computer works today, and that it did all month, and that everything is going as expected. So that's a thing that can only go wrong. Projects, however, or digital strategy, that can only go right. If you're a CIO, when you start a project, all project starts are successes. If a project is not a success, it's in the end, not in the beginning. And what you see is that the risks, they tend to happen, they tend to connect to operations. So there are lots of problems or potential problems on operations, but the CIO thinks, well, whatever happens, it always will go wrong. So if I got hacked or I don't get hacked, that's not much of a difference. Everyone gets hacked, that's no problem. This is more realistic on how a CIO categorizes his risk. So you have risk, all right. That's not my risk, other people's risk. We have minor risks, so okay, if this risk materializes and it happens, that's not a very big problem. And then you have risks in the category that is becoming interesting. And that's where it can cost me something, my bonus, or my job, maybe something else. But then that is where you get the attention of the CIO. I always call it the 8 o'clock news risk. That's when you have serious risks. And that doesn't only go for IT or or information security, that goes for all kinds of risks. If you have a CFO, he has financial risks, and there's the same problem. He will look at the risks and he sees so many risks, and what does he focus on? He focuses on the 8 o'clock news. We don't want to be in the news. We don't want to be in the newspapers. That's bad news. So some things are rather difficult to measure. How good is good enough? What is security? What is security risk? And that's where compliance comes in. And I think this is something we also recognize as professionals. And we get something like this. No one at home, sliding doors full open. So we have a risk, obvious risk. But the beauty of compliance is that you can make improvements. For instance, like this. And next year everyone says, well, you did a good job. You made an improvement. I feel different about it. So how do we solve this challenge? And by the way, I like to make a sidestep. But, do I have audio? Yes. This is our challenge. Where we're here for 2 days with a challenge on our back. Anyone try to solve this puzzle? For this is a small hint. It wasn't first there. So how do you get the CIO, CFO, CXO to act on the risks? I think you have to make it real. You have to make the risks that are so-called unreal, you have to make them real risks. Now, how do we make it real? It helps to take a look and see what does not help. Telling that the problems a CIO or a CFO has, that those problems are not solvable, that doesn't help. There are a lot of hackers who are very proud to have a 100% penetration score, and that's great, but that doesn't help. And it doesn't help because the CEO gets the feeling that whatever I do, I will always fail. So it's no use putting money in it because it's a thing you can't solve anyway. So I'll leave it to where it is. What also doesn't help is not delivering any proof of likelihood. And that's a problem when we learn that risk is a chance of impact, but the chance of something happening is always a discussion. As long as it didn't happen, it's always a guess, and security professionals, they tend to think that the chance is much higher than the CIO does. Usually they think, well, that's not going to happen, it's difficult, never heard of it, don't know what it is, I just don't understand. So that's a calculation that's hard to make. The impact is usually easily agreed on. Well, if it happens, we'll have a problem. But on the other side, the chance, well, it won't ever happen, so the rest, if I make an estimate of the residual risk, it is very low, so I'll take my chances. That's what's happening. And what also doesn't help, that is presenting a problem without a solution. CIOs, CFOs always told me, I don't want to know if you don't have a solution to it. Don't tell me a problem. I want to be ignorant. And too much information tends to ruin the happiness. So they want to hear solutions. They don't want to hear problems. Does anyone remember the Will It Blend series on YouTube? Well, this is an example. This is the one where the iPhone next to another phone was blended. It was an iPhone 6, and it blends, of course. But does this prove that the iPhone is insecure? Don't think so. So this is something you just don't want to do. This is not something you're gonna reach the CIO with. You will think, well, that's not a problem. It's supposed to blend, so there's not a real risk. There's not a real problem, and no one's gonna fire me because the iPhone 6 will blend. By the way, there was a phone that didn't blend, the Sony XP3300. If you Google it and you look at film, it's wow. So how do we make it real? The best way, or the thing that gave me best results, was with a game. I've done this once. I was inspired by Bruce Schneier's, who has movie plot thread contests every year. And so I said, well, let's try that in our own company, and let's ask our own employees to write a story about what can go wrong. And we had someone from the board and the jury, and it was big fun, because you have awareness at employee level. Everyone heard of it, everyone was thinking, well, what could go wrong? We had awareness at the board level, and several scenarios came out, and the winner and the second and the third runner-up, those were all scenarios that we didn't want to publish. So that was the original idea. We asked people to make a movie plot-like scenario, and then we pick a winner, and we'll make a blog out of it, or we present it in some other way. But it was something we couldn't do. But it really helped, because there was a lot of improvements, and the cost was low, and we had, as I said, awareness. So then went very well. The what-if scenarios, storytelling, that works fairly well if you do disaster recovery planning. And then usually you're not alone, because a disaster is typically a fire or something, and then a building, for instance, is lost. So you do it with the CISO, you do it with IT, you do it with HR department, with facilities department, and that also helps. And it gives an insight in, okay, how dependent are we on our IT, on our IT infrastructure, on our computers. The plain traditional risk analysis, which are also performed several times, multiple times, often maybe, that doesn't help very much. You don't get the board at the table in a brainstorm session to think about risks, so you get a level below it. And then we end up with a list, well, where everyone agrees, well, these might be risks, but nothing happens from there. That's very hard to do. So how can hackers help? Well, obviously, hackers could also help to make the unreal things real. And the most things that hackers can do, the best things that hackers can do, that is prove something about the likelihood of things, of problems, of risks. The best proof that something can happen is if it already did happen. So if a hacker proves that something is possible, then an unreal risk has become real. And hackers can push out that in the form of responsible disclosure. So what would I like you to learn from this? I like you to remember two things. And that is the way of how a CIO does risk management, how a CFO does risk management. And what he does, that's what we talked about it a few minutes ago. That's bonus, that's job, that's, well, something in the news, in the newspapers, 8 o'clock news on television. That's the risk. There is a book written by Chris van 't Hof about responsible disclosures. It's called Helpful Hackers. And he describes one of the best hackers. His name is Victor Gevers. And he has done thousands of responsible disclosures. And that also really helps. But if you're doing this for pay, and this Ricky Gevers guy, he doesn't do it for pay, so most of you will, then remember the CIO and ask yourself the question in your reports, well, what happens if this flaw that I found, if it is misused? What is the impact on the CIO? What is the impact in terms of things going wrong, things going in the news, things regarding his bonus or his job? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Does anybody have questions for Chris? Yeah, there's a question.
As one of the solutions, you I saw in the slide is to have a CVSS score,
yeah.
And you explain. Okay, you have to explain the impact of the vulnerability you found.
Yeah. Isn't
that what should be in the report in the first place? How is this new?
It is. It's what we would like to do is to make distinguishes between several problems that you find usually when you do your pen testing or security assessment. And it's hard to make it measurable. And one way to do it is a CVSS score. And not all reports that I have received in the course of the years have something like that. So what you get in a report is then a report of technical problems. And those technical problems aren't translated to business problems or CIO problems. And that's what we need to do. So there is for instance, what we had a couple of days ago, there was a problem with an application. You could inject HTML, you could inject JavaScript, but it was on the back end. So the own employees, they filled a database with a web application, and from there it was possible to inject. Well, it's not good, but it's not that bad. It would have been a lot more bad or a lot worse if it was possible for someone on the internet to do that. Then you have a much greater risk. So in the first place, it's not a thing that a CIO will get fired for, but in the latter example, it is. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
More questions in the audience? No? Okay, then, here's another one.
Thank you. So most of the time security is the trade-off for performance and sometimes availability. So this is probably another showstopper in trying to explain that unreal things can be real. But my question is, how can we convince management to invest more on the security awarenesses at developers and so on? in the development phase.
You mean?
How can we convince CISO, for example, to invest more on the security awarenesses programs in their company?
Well, the best thing to convince them is that they are accountable when they don't. For up to now, if there's a problem in a newly designed program, a new written program, then I don't think the CIO will have the problem, because he points at the development team and says, well, it's their fault. That's it's a problem of who is accountable for this situation, and that's very hard, because they always point to another one. That's one of the problems. That's so-called not my problem. It's the problem of the development team. By the way, in my experience, if you build something new and you build it from scratch, and you're a CISO, and you say, well, I as a CISO, I want to take part in all the projects they are running, and I want to see the first drafts, and I want to see the first architectural plans, then this will not likely be a problem, because when you start from the beginning with attention for security, it will be built in at almost no cost, and there's no one asking questions about the cost because it's so low. So as a CISO, you try to manage programs from the earliest stages on possible. Is that an answer to your question? Okay.
Any more questions for Chris? No? Then I'd like to thank Chris for his presentation, and we'll move on to the next one.